We're truly honored today to have Secretary Liu with us. To have the Secretary of the Treasury to speak to us about some of the issues that we've just been touched on by our panel, but many others, and to lead the discussion, moderating this wide-ranging discussion, and also to introduce the Secretary. Let me introduce Jared Bernstein. Jared is an Economic Policy Fellow of the Milken Institute. He's a Senior Fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And previously, he was Chief Economist and Economic Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden and a member of President Obama's economic team. Please welcome Secretary of the Treasury Jack Lew and Jared Bernstein.
Well, thank you so much, Mike, for that nice introduction. And Secretary Lew, it's such a pleasure to be here with you. I remember the days when we were both in the Obama administration. I remember one meeting up in Larry Summers' office at the NEC many years back where unemployment was very uncomfortably close to 10%, and the budget deficit was uncomfortably close to 10%, and we've covered a lot of ground since then.
Sure have.
It's an honor to be here with you. Let's start with Puerto Rico. I know that you and the Treasury Department have been very active in trying to underscore the urgency of the debt crisis. Yesterday, as you know, I know you wrote a letter to Congress to this effect, the Government Development Bank, that's the island's fiscal agent, in case people aren't familiar, which it's the source of the cash flow to many government agencies and services, defaulted on part of a debt payment. That part of a debt payment is an important part of my question, though, because apparently the government was able to defer a small bit of the payment to a group of creditors. Others have noted, people I've spoken to here have noted that the yields on municipal bonds haven't really shown a great impact from yesterday's default. And so I think what we worry about here, at least what I worry about, is a kind of a muddling through that undermines the urgency that I know you've been trying to urge on the Congress. I'd like to ask you, what needs to happen to underscore that urgency, to get Congress to act, and what are the costs of not acting?
Well, good to be with you today, Jared, and good to be here at the conference. I think that if you look at the situation in Puerto Rico, it has been a crisis unfolding for years. It's now well underway. It's not about a crisis that's about to happen. It's not just a question of bond payments. I'll get back to the bond payments. There's 3.5 million American citizens who live in Puerto Rico. They're living in a community which is seeing hospitals close wards, schools shut down, rationing of medicines, not enough money to pay for food for public programs. I think that the crisis for the people of Puerto Rico is immediate and it's real. This is not the first act of default. Puerto Rico has failed to make payments on other bonds, and it's been growing in terms of the size and the sensitivity of the missed payments. They passed a local statute that gave them the ability to put on a moratorium in place to not make these payments to the government development the Government Development Bank bonds. They have another much larger series of payments coming up in just a few weeks at the beginning of July. I think that the challenge is for Congress to act fast enough so that the unfolding crisis in Puerto Rico doesn't cascade out of control. Because in the absence of a restructuring, what you will end up with is a chaotic unwinding which does enormous harm to millions of Americans, including veterans who've served loyally in our military. And that, I believe, is something that has more of a potential spillover risk to the municipal bond market than anything else. The market has seen Puerto Rico as being distinct from other municipal credit for some time. It has been seen as being more risky. The risk associated with Puerto Rico has not spilled over to other issues. I think what we haven't seen in this country is the kind of situation that you could have in Puerto Rico where the next step is not just shutting down hospital wings, but they may not be able to pay the police or the fire department. It could be a complete unwinding of what we know is kind of normal life in any American community. And I think I have to just remind all of us, Puerto Ricans are American citizens. They don't have to stay on the island. Last year, almost 100,000 people left the island, moved to the mainland. Now, that's terrible for the economy of Puerto Rico. It means doctors and lawyers are leaving, entrepreneurs are leaving. The future for Puerto Rico to have an economy so that it can make payments on any of its obligations depends on having a solution. So all stakeholders really ought to have an interest in getting Puerto Rico back on a track where it can maintain some kind of fiscal balance and grow in the future.
I mean, one of the things that I worry about in this context is restructuring morphing into bailout. Is that a germane concern, and could you talk a little bit about that?
You know, there's been
I think some people conflate the two, and I think they should.
I think that instead of conflating them, one should think of them as polar opposites. We have a well-established practice in the United States and in many countries that have good rule of law that when an institution, whether it's a business or a municipality, is insolvent, they restructure. Because Puerto Rico is a territory, it does not have access to the kind of restructuring authorities that a business that hit hard times or a city that hit hard times would be able to take advantage of. Why do you have restructuring authorities like that? Because the alternative is chaos. It's decades of litigation. It's fighting over a shrinking pie where some win and others lose, and there's no equitable balancing of interests. What this restructuring authority would do is put in place in Puerto Rico a kind of orderly process for an independent oversight authority to both make sure that there's prudent fiscal policies in place, but also to make sure that the restructuring plan is fair to all stakeholders. I think that the cost of delay is that you get to a point where there's nothing to restructure. I mean, if you get to a point where the restructuring can't work, then you either let chaos happen or you have a bailout. I believe restructuring is the alternative to a bailout.
So in other places where we've seen some dimension of these dynamics in place, whether it's Greece or Detroit or Puerto Rico, the problem often begins with a fundamental mismatch between growth and debt. There's nothing wrong with borrowing. That's been something I've tried to stress in my work, especially when it's on behalf of productive investments, and in fact, not to borrow to help invest in productive public goods is a great way of undermining, I think, growth rates. But Puerto Rico basically borrowed year after year to meet operating costs while its economy flatlined. When you do that, the debt burden tends to grow faster than your income, and that invokes this unforgiving arithmetic of over-indebtedness. What steps should be taken as part of a restructuring package that might reduce the future risk of this sort of a problem, and that may involve some sort of an oversight function?
Yeah, I think that Puerto Rico has a debt burden that is in a league of its own in the United States. There's no other municipality that has the amount of indebtedness compared to the size of its economy that Puerto Rico has. There's 3.5 million people and $70 billion of debt. It's a small economy with an enormous debt. The debt was used to pay for operating expenses, to pay for debt service. And look, everyone was part of this process. In a low-yield environment, Puerto Rico debt was triple tax exempt. It became an attractive way to get a high yield. And a lot of money was available to put off the day of reckoning. 2 years ago, I was saying Puerto Rico was already approaching a crisis, but they were still able to borrow at very high interest rates because the market was still providing access. I think the goal here has to be that Puerto Rico, in the end, as any restructured entity does, comes out with a sound fiscal position and the ability to access the markets in an appropriate way. I think the oversight authority is key. Puerto Rico needs to adhere to the commitments it makes, both in terms of its budget and spending, its tax policies, what it does to stimulate growth in its economy. And I think all stakeholders, creditors and others, have an interest in there being a strong oversight function.
So let me ask you about stakeholders and creditors, I think, because in your letter to, I think, was it to Paul Ryan yesterday?
To all four leaders of Congress.
Okay, so in your letter you wrote yesterday about this, you wrote the following thing. In the coming days, it is important to keep in mind that further inaction only gives those seeking to deter Congress from passing a bill more time to continue making inaccurate and misleading claims about this legislation. And of course, we're talking about the
advertising campaigns. Yeah.
So who are those seeking to deter Congress?
You know, there are a lot of stakeholders, and I think it's a danger to paint with one brush, a broad brush, all the same. I think that there are many of the creditors who would see there as being a very good reason and useful function to have an oversight board and a restructuring. I think there are others who think that they want to maximize their chance of getting a dollar on a dollar, even if everyone else gets nothing and even if the whole system collapses. That's why you need to have a restructuring process. You can't have a process that requires everyone to buy in. If everyone has to buy in, then as we saw in Argentina, holdouts can drive a process to the brink.
15 years.
Puerto Rico doesn't have 15 years.
No.
If this goes into litigation and the different classes of bondholders are fighting in court for 10 to 15 years, there won't be anything left of Puerto Rico.
Yeah, I think that's a really germane point. Once the Government Development Bank starts defaulting, as you've mentioned, that's the source of cash flow to the services. And I read this morning that they're having trouble getting the fuel to put in police cars.
They're having trouble getting the fuel to put in police cars. They're having trouble. Puerto Rico has to import everything onto the island from off of the island for food, for basic needs. If you can't pay your bills, if everything is COD, at some point you can't buy things. Mm-hmm. And public authorities will not be able to function.
Okay, let's shift to another pleasant topic, which is housing finance. This conference, which I've attended for many years, has always had a firm grasp of issues around housing finance. And I think there's a considerable concern, uncertainty as to what the government's and the Treasury's position is on the current state of affairs in housing finance. The GSEs remain in conservatorship. There seems to be a kind of status quo such that there's a bit of a muddling through risk. What do you, how do you at Treasury view the current status of our housing finance system, the status of the GSEs, and what do you see would be the best way forward?
Well, Jared, clearly the best way forward would be comprehensive legislation to reform our housing finance system. It's something that we worked very hard on.
Let me interject for a second. What would be some components of comprehensive housing finance reform that you'd like to see in such a bill?
Look, I think that there's a need for there to be an alternative way to have securitization structured so that the risks of loss are properly allocated to different parties, and the government isn't standing behind the risk the way it does in conservatorship or the way it did before with Fannie and Freddie. There have been legislative efforts to do that, and at the same time, to use that process to help provide resources for affordable housing and to also open the system up so that there'll be an ease of securitization so that many parties would be able to come in and participate in that process. To their credit, the regulator, the FHFA, has been taking steps in that direction. But like so many other areas, there's a limit to what you can do with administrative authority. They are, in fact, working on developing a common securitization platform. They are, in fact, developing models of allocating first dollar risk so that there can be more appropriate burden sharing, which is important as a model for the future. They can't go all the way, and it would take legislation to do that. They're even doing some of the work to try and put resources into affordable housing. All these things could be done in a way that was much more effective with legislation.
I see a theme to some of our comments here. End of the day, though, do you believe that there should be a government role in housing finance that's some form of backstopping? Granted, you want to bring up the PLS or the private side of the credit story here, but end of the day, should there be a government role in backstopping this system in some way, shape, or form?
In the discussions on housing finance reform legislation, the question was, how do you cabin what a backstop would be so that it's not an open-ended commitment, which is what we had in the ad hoc arrangement before the financial crisis. I think there are ways to do that. There are actually various ways to do that. They're not ways that we can implement with administrative discretion alone. That's the problem.
Let me just riff for a second.
Our system actually was designed to have legislation make major new policy. So I'm not actually saying anything that our founding fathers didn't.
Assume a functional.
Yeah.
Now, look, I want to just interject something because I just read this. I'm working on a piece on productivity growth, which is a real problem for us and many other advanced nations right now. And a really insightful economist Barry Eichengreen doing a set of correlations. It's very hard to figure out what drives productivity growth, but he and his co-authors argued that actually a component of productivity growth that actually makes a difference is functional government that can legislate the kinds of problems we're talking about. In everything we've talked about so far, Puerto Rico, housing finance, we'll get to inversions in a second, there's a muddling through risk that maybe looks okay from the outside. We still have an economy that's worth $18 trillion in growth rates that are better than most other advanced economies. And yet, I started to worry more and more about these risks. Can you speak?
Yeah, I mean, Jared, thinking back to the days when we worked together in the White House, we didn't muddle through so well for a couple of years. We had government shutdowns. We had periodic risks of default on the federal debt. And you go back to those days and you look at what the mood in the global financial marketplace was, it was high anxiety. There is an expectation that the United States will govern itself in an orderly way. When that expectation is unsettled, it causes a great deal of nervousness. Now, I think we've actually done quite a bit better in the last few years. The fact that we've had several years of budget agreements that walked away from across-the-board cuts that were never meant to be permanent and put in place spending caps that provide resources in a more appropriate way. The fact that we were able to avoid a big default crisis and get a couple of years before we have to deal with it again, that kind of caused everyone to relax a little bit on the basic capacity of the United States to govern itself. On the bigger policy issues, we've made very incremental progress. So look, for example, at infrastructure.
Yeah.
The legislation that we enacted last year was certainly better than limping along 6 months at a time.
Explain what this is transportation.
At the end of last year, we passed a 5-year reauthorization of our transportation programs. That means that authorities around the country, mostly state authorities, have a planning horizon which you need to plan and implement infrastructure effectively to work with. What we didn't do is put in place the kind of increase in investment in infrastructure that we need to start to chip away at the real gaps we have in an aging and inadequate infrastructure system. One of the things we need as a country to be competitive in the future is to remain at the cutting edge of where the world is on our seaports, our airports, our roads. We're not going to be there if we don't start investing again. I don't think it's too late. I think we're still on a very high level in terms of comparison to the world, but others are going to catch up and exceed where we are. And if you want to have the deep draft port, it won't be in the United States. If you want to have the roads that can take the extra large trucks to carry modern loads, it won't be in the United States. That matters to doing business in the United States.
I mean, those things.
And that takes bipartisanship to do.
And those things feed right into productivity growth, to a kind of investment deficit that we've seen, particularly on the public side. You're reminding me of a conversation I've had here with many people, including Alan Schwartz and I were on a panel, and in fact, he and I are writing something about this, about how that kind of investment seems to us, and he comes more from the right side of the fence, just seems like a no-brainer, and it's really actually hard to run into economists of any stripe who disagrees with this point.
It's also hard to run into an elected official who doesn't believe we should invest more in infrastructure, but in order to invest more, you have to agree how to pay for it.
Well, that's true, and we should talk about that. But this is another, Richard Rubin wrote a great piece in the Wall Street Journal a while ago where he said, you just reminded me of it, he said, it's hard to run into a legislator who doesn't want to do tax reform, and yet there's no tax reform. One might even ask the Talmudic question, if everybody wants tax reform, why is there no tax reform? So A, why is there no tax reform? And B, to get a little bit, to drill down in some specifics, while I happen to very much appreciate what the UST has done on inversions, on trying to block inversions, certainly doing so by rule change is potentially less lasting, more lurching, and kind of a less permanent framework for tax policy than doing through legislation. So if you can kind of riff off of those kinds of thoughts for a minute.
I think tax reform is something where there is actually the possibility of a bipartisan agreement on how to move forward. I think everyone agrees in principle that we have a system that's laden with loopholes that should be closed. We have rates that are at a statutory rate, the highest in the developed world, but the effective rate is about average. We've got a broken system that's skewing investment decisions around tax planning instead of productive investment, and we're driving companies to look at doing business in other countries to avoid U.S. tax system. We can fix that through tax reform. I think that we came closer than people think about a year ago to getting that bipartisan conversation into a good place. I had a lot of quiet conversations across party lines where there was an emerging consensus. I think that there was a political decision not to proceed. I think that there's there's a fundamental obstacle that we will have to overcome to do business tax reform, and that is to separate individual and business tax reform and not treat them as if they have to be done together. Individual tax reform is something that we should do. We should simplify the tax code, but there is a big debate about whether or not we need to raise more revenue or less revenue from our individual tax code. On the business tax side, while there's no question that there's a need to close loopholes, there's a pretty strong argument that you should plow back a lot of what you get from, if not everything that you get from closing loopholes, into lowering the rates, and that it can be a self-contained approach. Why could we not get there? We couldn't get there because there were interests that presented themselves as small business interests that put a block in the way of it that became politically insurmountable. And let me just say what that was, because I think it's going to come back in the future. You had organizations like the NFIB, saying that unless you lower the individual rate, you're hurting small businesses. 95% of small businesses would benefit from doing business tax reform as we proposed it. Things like letting small businesses deduct a bigger amount of their investments in plant equipment in the year they make the investment would affect all small businesses. The kinds of small businesses that wouldn't get the full benefit are the kinds of businesses that reorganized out of the corporate tax code to become limited partnerships to avoid taxation. Those are things like hedge funds, interstate pipeline companies. They're not mom and pop hardware stores. They're not 50-person small businesses that are the entrepreneurial startups. And I think that the larger firms that want to get the benefit of whichever system they can arbitrage actually put a stumbling block in the way of putting together a political consensus to do something that would be for the greater good. And I'm obviously speaking about it pretty directly, and there's some who won't like that I'm doing that, but whether it's this year, next year, or the year after, that's a hurdle we're going to have to get over.
I think that there is another theme I've heard throughout the conference this year. Various speakers have made the point that our budget situation, while perhaps much better than it was in terms of the deficit as a share of GDP, was 10%, now it's below 3%. The debt as a share of GDP is north of 70%. That's high in historical terms. And while interest rates are very low, and so that's helpful in terms of debt servicing, if they were to spike up, it gets pretty expensive when you have a stock of debt that large. It's my view, and I hear you kind of I want to ask you to clarify where you and the administration are on this, that revenue neutrality is actually too low of a bar for some kind of tax reform, because when I look at the challenges that government faces, whether it's paying for Social Security and Medicare as baby boomers age, when I look at pressures from inflation, population growth, when I look at the interest on the debt, when I look at the price growth of medical costs, which has come down considerably, but still is above general inflation typically, I think we're going to need more revenues. So I'd like to ask you, is revenue neutrality an adequate goal for tax reform? It seems to me it's too low a bar.
Yeah, I don't think it is the right goal for broad tax reform. I think one can talk about business tax reform on a revenue neutral basis because it's a relatively small part of our total tax system. I think when you talk more broadly about the individual income tax, frankly, we have a lot of things in this country we need to do to deal with some of the fundamental problems we face in terms of the inequitable distribution of opportunity and income in the country. We have a lot of proposals in our budget that people are pretty positive about to try to help deal with that.
Tell us about some of them.
I mean, things like paying for community college for anyone who goes and sticks with it and completes their program. Things like providing better child care and better maternal health benefits. I think that we can't talk about doing new things unless we have a way of paying for them. And the kinds of things we put in our budget to pay for them are things that also help to level the playing field, which has gotten quite skewed. So, for example, we propose to change the way we treat stepped-up basis, which is, or carried interest, which may not be popular with everybody in the room today, but if you think about what the inequities in our system are and why the American people are so angry about our system, things like that, the trade-off between who's paying taxes and who's not. Salaried people don't have any way of getting out of paying their taxes. And they see that people who are at the very top end can see enormous accumulation of wealth that goes untaxed for generations. It doesn't feel like it's on the level.
It's funny you should mention those points. Well, there's a couple of people who like that idea. I was earlier today, I was on CNBC talking about this comment that no less than Bill Gates made yesterday. Bill Gates was being interviewed, I think, on CNBC and said, maybe we ought to think about equalizing our capital gains rates and our income tax rates a bit more. And I know you guys have proposed taking the capital gains rate up to 28%, which I believe was the rate during...
Under the Clinton administration.
Well, under the Reagan administration.
Under the Reagan administration.
Yeah, under the Reagan administration. I see confusing Clinton.
It was the Reagan. It went down under the Clinton administration. In the
that's right. That's right. So that, that seemed to work well there. But I thought what Gates was talking about was important because, in my view, our businesses expend so much energy in trying to take advantage of these differential rates that is, at least from an economist's perspective, kind of non-economic energy being exerted. Listen, I wanted to ask you, we have a few more minutes. I have two more questions. One is about inversions, which we didn't talk about. Again, I just want to get your comments. I know you'd rather work with Congress on it, but to what extent do you feel concerned that the next president, whoever he or she is, could roll back some of these rule changes?
Look, I've been clear for several years now that the right way to deal with inversions is to do business tax reform. We should fix a broken system so that it doesn't drive businesses to look at things like inversions to get out of the U.S. tax code. Now, that doesn't make it right. The fact that you can do it, and we should take every administrative action we can to make it harder for companies to invert. And let me just take a step back and remind everybody what an inversion is.
Good idea.
An inversion is a company that's a U.S. company that's doing business in the United States, benefiting from everything that we've invested in, research and development, training our workforce, building our infrastructure, having rule of law and the systems that provide for stability in this country, and the best markets in the world. So you're benefiting from everything the United States has to offer. And then you change your home address to get out of the U.S. tax system, so other people have to pay the bills for providing what the U.S. has given to you. I don't think that's right. It shouldn't be legal. Tax reform should shut it down so that you can't do it. But in the meantime, we do have the ability administratively to take actions, imperfect though they may be, to make it harder. we've done 3 actions, and I've said from the start we are going to look at what we can do to try to shut this pipeline down. I'm pleased that we've had an effect of slowing down the pipeline. I don't know that we've shut it down. I don't believe it can be permanently shut down without legislation, because I'm quite sure that all of the things we can do administratively, there are a lot of smart tax lawyers and tax planners who are going to be able to figure out ways around over time. You need a law that fixes the tax code and that shuts down the pathway to inversions once and for all. I'm pleased that we were able to our tax lawyers are pretty smart too. You know, they've been working hard on this for years. They're going to keep working on it, but there's no way they can shut it down completely on their own.
So winding up, President Obama at the Correspondents' Dinner the other night, he always does this great comic routine. I think he may have, I don't know what he wants to do after he's done being president, but he could be a comedian if he wants to. He's really skilled at humor. But anyway, jokingly, he said, when I'm finished being president, I'm gonna go to Goldman Sachs and make me some serious Tubmans. So it's the Tubmans point I want you to talk about. I think he was joking, by the way.
Not about the Tubmans.
Not about the Tubmans. So that's, when you think about the stuff that the U.S. Treasury does and everything we've been talking about today, I think it's all very real and very important, but it's not the sort of thing that everybody carries around in their wallet every day. Here's something, a decision you're making that's going to, be something we'll see in our lives every day. I'd love you to talk a little bit about what that's been like.
So, Jared, there's very little we do that the people I meet when I go grocery shopping understand.
Right.
I have not been in a store or on the street since we made the announcement where somebody hasn't come up to me and thanked me and told me how important it is and what it means to them. And I think that there's nothing more basic to our economic life and in some ways our common social life than money. I mean, we use it all the time. It represents the solidity of the United States economy. It's what we use to take care of our basic needs. And the pictures we put on it matter. The pictures we put on it tell a story of our history, what we value, how we've developed, how we've grown. And about a year ago, we started a process that evolved over time because we said we were going to listen to the American people. And the day we made the announcement, I said I did this the old-fashioned way. We said we were going to listen, and we actually listened. And we got a lot of great advice about what women have contributed to our democracy, a lot of great advice about what in our history should stay on and not stay on our currency, and a lot of advice about what order we should do things in. I made a decision right from the start that the order was going to be clear. The order was driven by security considerations. As Secretary of the Treasury, the thing I can't cut corners on is the stability of our currency, and to open it to the risk of counterfeiting is not an option. So the sequence was preset. But we went large. We said we don't have to be talking about one face on one bill. We can be talking about the fronts and the backs of the bills. We can tell a story that shows how, as a democracy, we evolved over our history. And I have to say, the reaction that I've gotten has been quite overwhelmingly positive in terms of the decisions of what we are doing. And we're going to be putting Harriet Tubman on the face of the $20 bill. A story that is kind of incomparable in terms of how one person, through their own determination, regardless of where they come from, can change the course of our history.
Right.
From freeing individual slaves on the Underground Railroad, to being a scout and a spy for the Union Army, to starting and leading the fight for women's right to vote.
Wow.
This is a woman who grew up a slave and never learned to read and write. It's an unbelievably inspirational part of American history. And then, we're going to do a bunch of other things on the back of the 5, which now most people don't even know what's on the back of the 5. In case you want to turn it over and look, Lincoln's on the front, the Lincoln Memorial is on the back. We're going to bring the Lincoln Memorial to life, having scenes on it that show great events that happened at the Lincoln Memorial. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, the Marian Anderson concert in the 1930s, when concert halls in Washington were segregated, and working with Eleanor Roosevelt, she performed on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to 70,000 people. On the back of the 10, we're going to keep Hamilton on the face. On the reverse side, we're going to have scenes of the leaders of the fight for women's right to vote, plus a rally, a demonstration on the steps of the Treasury Department building, which was one of the major expressions of public support for women's right to vote. And on the back of the 20, we're going to continue, in addition to having Harriet Tubman on the front, to have the picture of the White House that's there now, and an image of Andrew Jackson, who also contributed to our history in important ways. And I have actually found that the wholeness of the approach has made it a pretty positive impression so far. So I'm feeling pretty happy about it.
Do you have any templates that you carry around with you? Could you pull out a Tubman and show it to us?
You know, we've been doing some mock-ups. The process of actually designing currency is a very complicated one. In addition to the artwork that's involved, you got to leave a lot of space for the security features.
You got to sign it?
You know, it's going to come out after somebody else is signing it.
That's right. Good point.
So
Good point.
only the mock-ups will have my signature, maybe.
Look, we have 3.5 minutes. Let me ask you kind of just a reflection. 3 minutes is probably not long enough for you to reflect, but do your best. You've been in high-level government service for a really long time. I mean, I remember when you worked for the Clinton administration, but also in Obama, OMB, Chief of Staff, Secretary Treasury. You know, people say, even old-timers like me and other elderly people I work with in D.C., that say that times are uniquely fractious right now, that the level of discourse has really devolved. And certainly some of what goes on the campaign trail would underscore that. I don't want to end on a dark note, but I do want to ask you to reflect on your long career and how you look at that question today.
You know, Jared, I've worked in divided government for most of my career. I worked for a Democratic speaker, Speaker O'Neill, during the Reagan administration. I worked for President Clinton when the Congress was Republican, and I've worked in the Obama administration. I can actually say a couple of things by way of reflection. One, in the time you're experiencing it, things seem to be as fractious and as difficult as they've ever been. And sometimes time goes by and people look back and say, it actually was more productive than you thought it was at the time. People look back at the Reagan-O'Neill years now almost nostalgically as years of great progress in terms of tax reform, Social Security reform, immigration reform. People look back at the Clinton administration of Clinton and Gingrich working together on budget agreements, whether you agree with the details or not, welfare reform, things that were very important, monumental accomplishments. I think people are going to look back at this period and also see that we accomplished great and important things. And I think that it will also be true that the partisanship heightened in each of the periods. I hope there's a way to ratchet back the partisanship. I hope there's a way to get back to working to try and solve problems, disagreeing where you have to and working together where you can. I think we serve the American people better when we do our business that way. But I think it's too soon to tell the history of this period. 20 years from now, someone will be standing or sitting on a stage like this, looking back at how we emerged from the depths of the worst recession since the Great Depression and all the steps we took over these last 8 years to put our country back on its feet and to point in the right direction. So I think there's an awful lot we've accomplished even during this period of hyper-partisanship. It's not something that I'm happy about. I think that the hyper-partisanship is fueled by the instantaneous nature of media and communications and the segmentation of communication so everyone talks to their own true believers and not to the American people more broadly. But I think it's also a fallacy of American history to think it's new. You go back and you read what Jefferson and Hamilton wrote about each other.
Some of those guys were shooting at each other.
It was pretty rough stuff. So it's not new. It always feels worse at the times we're in. It's also the responsibility of leaders, and that's elected leaders, it's appointed leaders, to constantly be trying to take the debate to a better place. And I think we all have to keep our eye on doing that.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Jack. Great conversation.
Thanks, Jared.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Jared. This is a wonderful conversation to not only end the lunch, but to kick us off as we go on to the second half of our marathon. So thank you again.